My daughter called me on a Sunday afternoon. I could hear wind chimes in the background, the kind you only get on a porch somewhere warm. "Dad," she said, her voice doing that careful sing-song thing she used whenever she'd already made a decision before asking me about it. "We sold the house in Maple Ridge last week. We figured you'd understand, since you're staying at the assisted place anyway." I stood in the doorway of my kitchen holding the phone against my ear, and I didn't say a word for nearly 10 seconds. I was doing the math. Not the kind of math where you add numbers, the kind where you add up years. 31 years in that house. The house my late wife Caroline had painted herself, room by room, the summer she was pregnant with our daughter Lindsay. The house with my name on the deed, not Lindsay's. I didn't yell. I didn't ask who gave her the authority. I simply said, "All right, sweetheart, I hope it sells you something good." I hung up the phone, walked into the small office I kept in the back bedroom of my condo, opened my laptop, and sent an email to a man I hadn't spoken to in 4 years. The subject line had only 3 words. Then I poured myself a glass of water, sat down in my reading chair, and waited for the world to start turning the way I needed it to turn. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone who shares your blood treat your whole life's work like it was theirs to spend, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I'd like to know who's sitting with me for this one. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 68 years old, and for 39 of those years, I built and ran a commercial insurance brokerage out of a converted garage in Lansing, Michigan, until it became one of the largest independent agencies in the Midwest. I started with a card table, a rotary phone, and a promise I made to myself the day my own father died with nothing, that I would never let my family inherit nothing. I built policies that protected factories, fleets, hospitals. I understood risk better than almost any man in my industry, because I had spent 4 decades reading the fine print other people skipped. And yet, somehow, the largest risk to everything I had built had been living 3 states away, calling me twice a year, and addressing me, more and more often, like a problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved. The call from Lindsay, my only child, 36 years old, was the spark. "We figured you'd understand." 5 words. Words that assumed something about me that simply was not true, that I had already given up, already faded, already become the kind of old man who doesn't need a house because he doesn't need much of anything anymore. As I walked down the hallway of my condo toward that back office, my mind went backward, the way it does more easily these days, to 18 months earlier, to the night Lindsay and her husband Trent sat across from me at my kitchen table, sharing a bottle of wine I'd bought for the occasion, and told me they had a plan. "Dad," Lindsay had said, reaching across the table to take my hand the way she used to when she was small and wanted something, "Trent's company is opening a regional office in Scottsdale. It's an incredible opportunity, but moving means buying a place out there, and with the market the way it is." She let the sentence trail off the way she always did when she wanted me to finish her thought for her and write the check before she had to ask for it directly. Trent had nodded along, his expression carefully arranged into something between gratitude and reluctance, the same expression a man wears when he's already counted the money in his head. "We hate to even bring it up, Walter," he'd said, "but it would mean everything to Lindsay to be settled before the baby comes. The baby, my first grandchild." They knew exactly which words to use. I remember the weight of my own checkbook in my hand that night, the particular scratch of the pen as I wrote out a number with 6 figures. A loan, I told myself, though no one ever called it that again after the ink dried. $210,000, transferred the following week, supposedly a down payment to help them get established in Arizona while Trent's transfer finalized. I had asked, gently, whether I'd see paperwork, a promissory note, anything formal. Lindsay had laughed, soft and wounded, like I'd insulted her. "Dad, it's family. We're not going to make you sign something." I should have known then. A man who spends his career writing contracts for strangers and refuses to write one for his own daughter is a man who has already decided to be a fool for love and call it generosity. What I did not know, sitting at that table, was that the $210,000 never went toward a house in Scottsdale at all. What I did not know was that 11 months later, my daughter and son-in-law would call me from an airport, casually mention a move I had already unknowingly financed twice over, and ask me to simply understand. What I did not know was that the real plan, the one that had been built carefully behind every soft-voiced phone call and every birthday card signed, "Love you, Dad," was something much colder and much more deliberate than a young couple chasing a job opportunity. I sat down at my desk that Sunday evening and opened the folder I had quietly kept for the past year, a habit born not of suspicion exactly, but of 40 years spent reading risk into every transaction that crossed my desk. Bank statements, wire confirmations. A copy of the durable power of attorney I had signed 18 months earlier, back when Lindsay had gently suggested it, just in case anything happens while you're traveling, Dad, so things don't get complicated. I had trusted her with that document the way I trusted her with everything, because she was my daughter, and because Caroline, before she passed, had made me promise to lean on Lindsay when the day came that I needed leaning on. I traced the wire transfers myself first, the old-fashioned way, the way I used to underwrite policies before computers did the guessing for us. The $210,000 had moved from my account into a joint account held by Lindsay and Trent, and from there, within 6 days, had been split. $60,000 had gone toward a down payment on a property in Scottsdale, just as they'd said. But the remaining $150,000 had moved into something called Sagebrush Ventures, LLC, a name I had never heard them mention once in 18 months of phone calls. My hands were steady as I typed the search into the Michigan and Arizona corporate registries. Sagebrush Ventures, LLC, registered the same month as our dinner conversation. Sole managing member, Trent Holloway. Not Lindsay, not jointly. Trent, alone. I sat back in my chair and let that settle into my chest, the way cold water settles into a wound, slow and complete. They had not needed help moving. They had needed seed capital, and they had dressed it up as a pregnancy and a job transfer because they knew that was the only story that would make an old widower reach for his checkbook without asking a single hard question. I am not a man who panics, and I am not a man who acts before he understands the entire shape of a thing. So I did what I have always done when something didn't add up. I picked up the phone and called the one person who had spent 30 years helping me untangle other people's lies for a living. Eleanor Voss had been my outside counsel since 1994, before she retired from the firm and started taking only the cases that, in her words, actually mattered. I told her everything. The wine, the check, the power of attorney. The phone call that morning that ended with my daughter selling the family home out from under me while calling it a courtesy. Walter, Eleanor said, after a long silence on her end of the line, I need you to tell me something honestly. Did you sign anything in the last 6 months that you don't fully remember signing? I told her I didn't think so. She told me to check anyway, and to check carefully, because in her experience, when a family member starts treating an elderly parent like someone who needs to be understood rather than consulted, it usually means somewhere, on some piece of paper, that parent has already been declared a little less capable than he actually is. It took Eleanor and a forensic associate of hers 4 days to find it. Buried in a stack of documents I had signed during a hospital stay the previous winter, a minor procedure, nothing serious, but I had been groggy from anesthesia and had signed a small mountain of paperwork that Lindsay herself had brought to my bedside, telling me it was routine insurance and discharge forms, was a document neither Eleanor nor I had ever seen before. A petition, prepared and notarized that same week, requesting the court evaluate my competency to manage my own financial affairs, supported by a brief, clinical letter from a physician I had never once met, describing early indicators of cognitive decline consistent with informant reports from family. Informant reports from family. My daughter had gone to a doctor, described symptoms I did not have, and built a paper trail to make herself the only person standing between me and a courtroom that would strip away my right to manage anything I'd spent a lifetime building. The house. The brokerage I had finally sold for retirement 4 years earlier, the proceeds still sitting in 3 separate trust accounts. All of it, suddenly, one signature away from being handed to a 36-year-old woman and her husband, whose actual business, Sagebrush Ventures, turned out upon further digging to be nothing more than a shell holding a single asset, a half-built insurance brokerage of their own in Scottsdale, designed, according to early marketing materials Eleanor's associate found archived online, to directly compete in 3 of the same commercial markets I had spent my career dominating. They were not simply taking my money. They were taking my money to build the very business I had built, in a market I had personally cultivated for decades, using my own clients' referral networks, which Trent I discovered with a particular quiet fury had begun quietly contacting under the company letterhead of Holloway Risk Partners, 6 weeks before that Sunday phone call ever came. I sat with that for an entire night. not sleeping, not pacing, just sitting in the dark of my living room with a glass of water going warm beside me, understanding, fully and completely, the shape of what had been done to me. The petition for competency evaluation had a hearing date. 11 days away, filed in a county court near Scottsdale, conveniently far from Michigan, where I would have had to fly across the country, disoriented and unrepresented, to even attempt to contest it. Eleanor explained, gently but plainly, that if I did not appear, or if I appeared and seemed even slightly confused under the pressure of a courtroom, a judge unfamiliar with me could very reasonably appoint Lindsay as my legal guardian on a temporary basis, pending further evaluation. Temporary guardianships, she told me, in her flat, professional voice, have a way of becoming permanent when no one is left to fight them. I asked her one question. Can we stop this quietly, or does it need to be loud? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Walter, she said, I think it needs to be exactly as loud as they were trying to make your silence. So we built something, not out of anger, though anger was certainly somewhere in the foundation of it, but out of the same cold, careful precision I had used my entire career to assess a risk and price it correctly. Eleanor brought in a colleague who specialized in elder financial exploitation cases, a sharp, soft-spoken attorney named Priya Nair, who had successfully unwound 4 similar schemes in the past 2 years alone, each one dressed up exactly like mine, in the comfortable, forgivable language of family helping family. We did not confront Lindsay by phone. We did not send an angry letter. Instead, 11 days became 9, became 7, and during that week I flew to Phoenix myself, quietly, on a commercial flight under my own name because I had nothing to hide and everything to verify in person. I did not tell Lindsay I was coming. I checked into a hotel 8 miles from the house she and Trent had just purchased, with the proceeds from selling my Maple Ridge home, a sale, Eleanor confirmed, that had been executed through that same power of attorney 6 days before the closing, without a single phone call to actually ask me whether I consented. I drove past the house once, slowly, the evening before the hearing. It was beautiful, stucco and red tile, a circular drive, the kind of house a young couple buys when they believe their future has already been secured by someone else's lifetime of work. I did not stop the car. I simply looked, and then I drove back to my hotel room, and I called Priya, and I told her I was ready. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning in a small courtroom that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. Lindsay arrived with Trent, and with an attorney of her own, a younger man who looked, I thought, mildly surprised when Eleanor and Priya walked in directly behind me, carrying 2 bankers' boxes of documentation between them. Lindsay's face, when she saw me sitting calmly in the gallery, went through 3 distinct expressions in the span of about 4 seconds. Confusion, then something like fear. Then, finally, a kind of brittle composure she must have practiced, because she lifted her chin and looked away from me entirely, toward her own attorney, as though I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. The judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Judge Renata Cole, began by asking Lindsay's attorney to summarize the basis for the competency petition. He spoke for several minutes about concerning patterns, about a father living alone, about a physician's letter expressing concern. Then it was our turn. Priya stood first. She did not raise her voice. She simply laid out, document by document, the timeline. The $210,000 transfer, framed as help for a move that never required that much money for a down payment alone. The formation of Sagebrush Ventures, 6 days later, with Trent as sole member. The power of attorney signed during post-anesthesia recovery, at Lindsay's specific direction, for paperwork she herself described to hospital staff as routine. The physician's letter, which Priya had subpoenaed records for, and which turned out to be based entirely on a single 15-minute phone consultation, paid for by Lindsay, in which the physician who, notably, had never examined me in person had been told by Lindsay that I frequently forgot conversations, repeated stories, and had recently given away large sums of money without explanation. Your Honor, Priya said, the only evidence of cognitive decline in this petition is a single uncorroborated account from the very person who stood to gain legal and financial control over Mr. Pruitt's entire estate had this petition succeeded. We would like to introduce, for the court's consideration, the actual financial records of the past 18 months, which demonstrate not confusion, but a man who has been the consistent, deliberate target of a coordinated financial scheme. Eleanor stood next and walked the judge through Holloway Risk Partners, the early marketing materials, the client outreach that had begun using contact lists Trent could only have obtained through Lindsay's access to my old business files she had retained, she claimed, for sentimental reasons. After I sold the brokerage, I watched Lindsay throughout all of this. I watched the brittle composure crack slightly, then more, then entirely. Somewhere around the moment Eleanor produced an email, recovered through formal discovery, in which Trent had written to a business partner 6 weeks earlier. Once the petition goes through and Lindsay's named guardian, we'll have full access to liquidate the trust accounts. Old man won't even know what hit him. The courtroom went very quiet after that line was read aloud. Judge Cole did not raise her voice either. When she finally spoke, she simply removed her glasses, set them down, and looked directly at Lindsay for a long moment before she said that she was not only denying the petition in full, but referring the matter to the county's Elder Abuse Unit for criminal investigation, given the apparent evidence of financial exploitation, fraudulent inducement, and what increasingly appeared to be deliberate misuse of a power of attorney document. Lindsay did not cry the way I might have once expected her to. She simply sat very still, staring at the table in front of her, while her own attorney leaned over and whispered something I couldn't hear and didn't particularly want to. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. I did not. I felt something closer to grief, the particular grief of watching the last illusion you were holding onto about a person finally, irreversibly, dissolve. This was my daughter, the girl who used to fall asleep on my chest during Tigers games on the radio. The girl Caroline had painted that nursery for 3 decades earlier, in a house that had just been sold out from under both of us. I did not speak to Lindsay as we left the courtroom. There was nothing left, in that moment, that needed saying that hadn't already been said by a stack of bank records and one very careless email. The criminal investigation took the better part of 4 months. I will not walk you through every motion and filing, because frankly, by the end of it I had grown tired of reliving it in such precise detail. What I will tell you is this. Trent was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraud in the formation of Sagebrush Ventures using misappropriated funds. Lindsay, given the mitigating circumstance that the petition itself had ultimately been denied before any harm was finalized, and given that this was, as her attorney argued at length, an otherwise law-abiding woman who had been led astray by her husband's ambitions, avoided criminal charges, but was ordered, in a separate civil judgment, to repay the full $210,000, plus interest, plus my legal fees, over a structured 10-year period. The house in Scottsdale, it turned out, could not legally be retained once the source of its down payment was determined to be the proceeds of fraud. It was sold at auction 8 months later. I did not attend the sale. I did not need to see it. There is a grandchild in this story, and I want to tell you about her now, because she is, in the end, the only part of this entire ordeal that matters to me anymore. My granddaughter, Sophie, was 11 months old by the time the civil judgment was finalized. I have not cut Lindsay out of my life entirely, though I understand if some of you watching tonight think I should have. I have simply built, with Eleanor's careful help, an irrevocable trust in Sophie's name, funded with a portion of what remained of my estate, structured so that not $1 of it can be accessed, borrowed against, or administered by either of her parents. Eleanor herself sits as trustee. The funds are earmarked strictly for Sophie's education and medical needs until she turns 25, at which point the remainder transfers to her outright, with a single letter from me, sealed and waiting, explaining everything that happened, so that she will someday understand exactly why her grandfather built it the way he did, and so that she might, I hope, learn something different from what her own parents tried to teach her by example. I see Sophie twice a month now. Lindsay brings her to a small park near my condo, and we do not discuss what happened. We talk about which birds are at the feeder, and whether Sophie prefers the swings or the slide, and I let myself, for 1 hour at a time, be simply a grandfather, nothing more complicated than that. I think often about that Sunday phone call. We figured you'd understand. I have turned that sentence over so many times in the months since, and I have come to believe that the cruelest part of it was never the dishonesty. People lie to each other for all sorts of reasons, and most of those reasons, even the bad ones, are at least human. The cruelest part was the assumption underneath it. The assumption that a man who built something from nothing, who buried a wife, who raised a daughter alone for the better part of a decade after that, had somehow become so small, so forgettable, so easily managed, that he would simply understand being erased from his own life's decisions. I am 68 years old, and I will tell you something I did not fully believe until this past year. Being underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you the most does not mean you have become weak. It very often means the opposite. It means you have spent so many decades being quietly strong, quietly capable, quietly generous, that the people closest to you forgot strength was ever something you had to choose, again and again, rather than something you simply ran out of. If you are watching this tonight, and somewhere in your own life, a son, a daughter, a grandchild, has decided that your silence means your surrender, I want you to hear this clearly. It does not. Tell me, in the comments, what state you are watching from, and if you have ever had to remind someone you love exactly who built the ground they are standing on. Stay sharp, stay steady, and never, ever mistake a calm man for a finished one. Strength was never about being loud. It was about Walter staying steady through that one quiet 10-second pause before answering the phone, and through every careful week that followed. Real love checks in, asks before it acts, and never mistakes someone's calm for permission to take. And when family forgets that, the gentlest answer is still the firmest one to protect what matters, especially the smallest hands that didn't choose any of it. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a small, positive life lesson along the way.